Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, the podcast that takes, those really dense academic papers and makes them surprisingly interesting. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
Today we're going to unpack this fascinating concept from retail psychology.
Okay.
It's called perceived assortment variety.
Interesting.
Yeah, and we're tackling this pretty dense academic paper here. So
Yeah.
major kudos to you for wanting to dive into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
You're about to understand how retailers can subtly make you think there's way more variety than there actually is.
That's so cool.
This stuff is useful whether you're a shopper or a business owner, or even if you're just
Right.
fascinated by how our minds work.
Yeah, what's fascinating is that it goes way beyond just the number of items on a shelf.
Right, yeah.
There are seriously subtle tactics at play here.
Okay, so let's break it down. What exactly is perceived assortment variety?
Sure.
Or PAV, as I'm going to call it from now on.
Okay, PAV, think of it as having two main ingredients.
Okay.
The first one is numerosity.
Numerosity.
That gut feeling of, whoa, look at all the choices when you walk into a store.
Yeah, they got-
It's the sheer quantity that hits you first.
So like those warehouse stores where you practically need a GPS to navigate the aisles.
Exactly. But there's a second layer, and this is where things get interesting.
Okay.
It's called diversity.
Diverse.
It's that sense that the items are truly different from each other. They have unique qualities
Yeah.
that make them stand out.
So a store with 100 red shirts wouldn't feel as diverse as a store with, say, 50 shirts, but in all sorts of colors and styles.
You got it. Diversity is key to that feeling of a wide selection.
Okay.
It's like a spice rack. Having 20 jars of the same paprika doesn't make it a diverse collection.
Okay. That metaphor is making my stomach rumble a little bit, but I get the point.
Okay, good.
So how do retailers actually use this PAV knowledge to influence us?
Well, one tactic is the most obvious one. Just cram as many things onto those shelves as possible
Right.
to play into our sense of numerosity.
Makes sense.
But research actually shows there's a point of diminishing returns with this approach. Seeing like 300 items isn't really that much more impressive to our brains than seeing, say, 60.
So more isn't always better.
Nope. In fact, studies by Dial and Pointer and
Okay.
Iyengar and Lepper suggest that too much choice can actually backfire.
Really?
Shoppers get overwhelmed, and they might actually buy less.
Wow.
This whole concept of choice overload can actually make it harder to make a decision.
So it's not just about filling every inch of space. What else are these retailers doing?
Well, they get clever with assortment composition.
Assortment composition.
Strategically swapping out similar items for ones that are more distinct.
Okay.
For example, instead of having rows and rows of basic running shoes,
Right.
a store might mix in shoes designed for different terrains or, levels of support,
Okay.
or even just different color combinations.
Right.
Even if the total number of shoes on the shelf stays the same,
Yeah.
it creates the illusion of greater variety without needing a warehouse-sized store. So sneaky but clever. They're playing with our sense of diversity without actually needing more physical space.
Exactly. But it gets even more subtle with something called structure management.
Structure management. Tell me more. This sounds intriguing.
So think about how the assortment is organized.
Okay.
One aspect of this is the arrangement.
Okay.
How items are grouped and ordered on the shelf.
Right.
A simple example is a wine section.
Yeah.
Wines organized by region or grape variety will be perceived as more diverse than bottles just randomly placed on a shelf.
Right.
It helps us compare and contrast,
Okay.
making the differences more apparent.
Makes sense.
Well-
A little organization helps us appreciate the variety. Would that mean that a more organized store always feels more diverse?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Here's a curveball. Research suggests that for smaller assortments,
Yeah.
let's say under 20 items,
Yeah.
a little bit of disorganization can actually increase perceived variety.
What?
Our brains find a touch of randomness more interesting. So you're telling me that a little bit of organized chaos can be a good thing for smaller displays.
Think about your favorite independent bookstore.
Oh.
There's a certain charm to that slightly chaotic, curated feel.
Right?
It feels more diverse and interesting than a perfectly ordered big box bookstore. Right?
That's a great example. I never would have thought that a lack of order could actually increase perceived variety.
Exactly. But this effect tends to reverse for larger assortments.
Okay.
When we're faced with a massive selection, our brains crave structure to help us process all that information.
So when there are more options, a clear layout helps us see those distinct groupings and appreciate the differences. What other tricks fall under this structure management umbrella?
There's also visual layout.
Visual layout.
This is where retailers use things like color spacing and physical boundaries to influence our perception.
Okay.
Imagine a shelf of socks, all very similar in color.
Okay.
By adding subtle color gradients to the display,
Right.
they can make those slight differences in shades seem more prominent.
So they're visually amplifying the diversity, even if the socks themselves aren't dramatically different.
So are you saying there's a sweet spot for this visual organization too, just like with the arrangement?
Exactly. For smaller assortments, say 20 to 40 items, a more deliberate visual layout actually helps highlight the differences and increase that perception of variety.
Okay.
But for really large selections, it's less about the specifics of the layout and more about just giving our brains a framework to process that vast amount of information.
So it's all about finding the right balance for the size of the assortment. What about other types of information, like how products are described or labeled? Does that play into PAV at all?
Interestingly enough, research has shown that textual information, things like product descriptions and labels, doesn't seem to have a significant impact on PAV.
That's surprising. You'd think all those fancy descriptions and labels would play a bigger role.
It seems our brains are more focused on the visual cues when it comes to judging variety.
Of course, this might change depending on the specific product and how much information we need to make a decision. But in general, it seems like the visual aspects of the assortment have a stronger influence.
So we've talked about numerosity, diversity, and all these clever tactics retailers use. But when it comes to PAV, which of these factors really packs the biggest punch? So we just left off talking about which factors have the biggest impact on PAV. Is it all about the number of items or how different those items are?
That's where things get nuanced. While assortment size definitely drives our sense of numerosity, it has less impact on perceived diversity. So if a retailer wants to really emphasize a diverse selection, they need to focus on those other strategies we've been talking about: composition, arrangement, and a visual layout.
Okay, so those sneaky tactics are the real key to boosting that sense of diversity.
Exactly. And this is where things get even more complex, because diversity is actually harder for our brains to process, especially when we're faced with massive assortments.
That makes sense. Our brains are probably working overtime trying to categorize and differentiate between all the options.
Right. And that's why the retailer's strategies become even more important in shaping our perception of how diverse the selection truly is.
So it's like a tug of war between our brain's capacity to process information and the retailer's attempts to influence our perception.
I like that analogy. It highlights the dynamic nature of this whole concept. But remember, it's not just the retailer pulling the strings. We as shoppers also influence our own perception of variety.
Wait, you're saying it's not just about the retailer's tricks. We're part of the equation too.
Absolutely. Things like our familiarity with a product category, our level of expertise, and even our mood can all play a role in how we perceive assortment variety.
So if I'm a complete novice when it comes to, say, craft beer, I might walk into a specialty beer store and be blown away by the selection.
Right.
While a seasoned beer aficionado might see right through the sheer quantity and focus on, specific breweries or style.
Precisely. Experts, by definition, have a more refined understanding of the subtle differences between products.
So
they can see through those tactics that might fall someone who's less familiar with the category.
So expertise can actually make us more discerning shoppers.
Yeah.
That's a good argument for expanding our horizons and becoming mini experts in the things we buy regularly.
I agree. The research backs this up too. Experts are less likely to experience that, wow, so many choices feeling. They're looking for specific qualities, not just quantity.
Right.
They have a framework for understanding what constitutes true variety in that category.
That makes a lot of sense. What about familiarity?
Okay.
If I'm a coffee addict who's been brewing my own beans for years, I probably don't get as overwhelmed by the coffee aisle at the grocery store as someone who just buys pre-ground coffee, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Your familiarity acts as a filter, helping you quickly navigate the choices and find what you're looking for.
Okay.
This actually prevents you from getting bogged down by too many options, which, as we talked about before, can lead to decision fatigue.
It's like having a mental shortcut that says, okay, I know what I like in this category, so I can ignore all the noise.
Precisely. And that's a valuable skill in today's world where we're constantly bombarded with choices.
So we've got expertise, familiarity. But you mentioned something even more intriguing, our mood. How can that possibly affect how we perceive variety?
Well, research has shown that our emotional state can definitely color our shopping experience.
Really?
For example, if we're feeling happy and optimistic, we tend to perceive greater assortment variety.
So if I just got good news and I'm feeling upbeat, I'm more likely to walk into a store and think, wow, look at all this amazing stuff.
It might sound counterintuitive, but yes. When we're in a positive mood, we're more open to exploring and trying new things.
Yeah.
We're more likely to notice those subtle differences between products and appreciate the variety that's being presented to us.
That's fascinating. So our emotions aren't just affecting how we feel, they're actually shaping how we perceive the world around us, including the retail world.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we're not always the rational beings we think we are.
Right.
Our feelings play a much bigger role in our decision-making than we might realize. And this is true in all areas of life, not just shopping.
Okay, so we've covered how expertise, familiarity, and even our mood can influence PAV.
Right.
What about the context of the shopping experience itself? Does where we're shopping or what we're shopping for matter?
Absolutely. The way an assortment is presented, the type of store we're in, and even the specific task we're trying to accomplish can all impact how we perceive variety.
Okay, let's start with presentation. Earlier, we discussed how arrangement and visual layout can be used to enhance PAV.
Right.
Are there any other tricks retailers might be using in terms of how they present products?
Well, research has shown that the level at which an assortment is presented can have an effect on our perception.
Okay.
We tend to see greater variety when we're looking at a smaller, more defined set of items.
Okay.
For instance, if we're browsing the wine section and we focus on a specific region or grape variety, we might perceive greater diversity within that category compared to looking at the entire wine selection as a whole.
So it's about narrowing our focus. It's like when you're overwhelmed by a giant menu at a restaurant and the server suggests a few specific dishes, suddenly it feels more manageable.
Exactly. It's about how our brains chunk information. When we zoom in on a specific category,
Right.
we can process the differences between products more easily and appreciate the nuances that might have been lost in the broader context.
So retailers can use this to their advantage by creating displays or sections that highlight the diversity within specific product categories.
Precisely. It's a way to guide our attention and enhance our perception of variety without actually needing to increase the overall size of the assortment.
Clever.
Yeah.
What about the type of store? Does that play a role in how we perceive variety? I imagine we might have different expectations when walking into a small boutique versus a giant superstore.
You're right. We bring our own biases and expectations to the shopping experience,
Okay.
and those can influence how we interpret the assortment.
Yeah.
For example, if we walk into a specialty store, we might be more attuned to the subtle differences between products.
Right.
Because we expect a curated, diverse selection within that specific category.
Oh.
In contrast, at a big box retailer, we might be more focused on the sheer quantity and range of products available.
So our preconceived notions about the store itself can shape our perception of what constitutes a good assortment.
Absolutely. It's another layer of complexity in this whole equation.
We've covered a lot of ground here. The retailer's tactics, our own psychology as shoppers, and even the context of the shopping experience itself. It's pretty clear that PAV is a multifaceted concept.
And it's a reminder that even seemingly simple judgments, like deciding whether a selection is diverse or not, are influenced by a whole web of factors, both conscious and unconscious.
So we've explored how retailers manipulate PAV, how our own psychology comes into play, and even how the context of the shopping experience matters. But how does all of this translate into actual shopper behavior? Does perceiving a greater variety actually make people buy more?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer, as you might expect, is complicated.
Hit me with the complexity. Does seeing more variety actually lead to more purchases?
Well, research shows that a wider perceived variety can be initially very attractive to shoppers,
Okay.
but it doesn't always translate directly into increased sales.
Interesting.
In fact, we've already talked about how too much variety can backfire and lead to that choice overload.
Right. When presented with too many options, we just get overwhelmed and give up.
Exactly. And that's why the retailer's strategies are so important. It's not just about creating a perception of variety, it's about crafting an experience that actually helps shoppers make a purchase. Finding that sweet spot between offering enough variety to entice people, but not so much that they get paralyzed by indecision.
So it's a delicate balancing act for retailers.
Yeah.
But does the sweet spot change based on what's being sold or who the target shopper is?
Absolutely. What works for a specialty cheese shop might not work for a big box electronics store. You know, it all depends on the specific context.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I'm seeing the retail world through a whole new lens. But before we wrap up, is there anything else about the relationship between PAV and shopper behavior that we should touch on.
Yes, there's an interesting finding that came up when we looked at what's called non-experimental research on this topic. This type of research observes real-world data, like actual sales figures, rather than conducting controlled experiments in a lab.
So it's about seeing how these concepts play out in the wild, so to speak.
Exactly. And this research revealed something really important. Some assortment management strategies that might make shoppers think there's more variety don't always result in positive outcomes for the retailer.
You mean what's good for the shopper's perception isn't always good for the store's bottom line?
That's right. For instance, simply increasing the number of products which we usually associate with more variety can backfire from a business perspective.
How so? You would think more options would equal more sales.
Well, bigger assortments mean bigger costs for the retailer. They need more shelf space, more inventory, and possibly even more staff to manage all those products.
Right.
If those increased costs don't translate to increased sales, it's a losing proposition.
So a strategy that might boost PAV and attract shoppers could actually hurt the retailer's profitability if it's not carefully planned and managed.
Exactly. It highlights the need for retailers to think strategically about how they manage their assortments.
Okay.
Considering both the shopper's perspective and the financial implications for their business.
That's a really important insight. We've talked a lot about how retailers can leverage PAV, but this reminds us that they also need to be mindful of the costs associated with those strategies.
It's a balancing act. But now that you're aware of this complex interplay between perception, behavior, and business strategy, you can be a more informed shopper and maybe even a more savvy business owner.
We've explored this fascinating world of perceived assortment variety, the tactics retailers use, our own psychology as shoppers, and how those things translate into actual purchasing behavior. What's the key takeaway you want to leave our listeners with?
Variety isn't a simple concept. It's deeply subjective and can be influenced by a multitude of factors. Retailers are savvy at playing on our psychology, but by understanding their tactics, we can become more empowered consumers making choices that are truly aligned with our needs and preferences.
It's like you've given us a secret decoder ring for navigating the retail landscape. Now we can see those subtle cues and strategies at play, helping us make more informed decisions.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe you'll even start noticing these same principles at work in other areas of your life.
A huge thank you to you for this incredible deep dive. It's been a true pleasure having you here.
The pleasure was all mine. I always enjoy exploring these hidden corners of consumer behavior.
And to you, our listener, thank you for joining us on this journey. It's your curiosity and thirst for knowledge that make these deep dives possible. And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts for more captivating deep dives like this one. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.